I would like to share with you all that last week, my firstborn child, my daughter Amina, was born. And it was a very, thank you, profound, dare I say, spiritual experience for me that words cannot easily describe what I felt in that moment. My best attempt would be to describe it as being washed over by an ocean of love and compassion. I'm sure many parents and grandparents had similar feelings, and I think we all can agree that it is pretty easy to show love and compassion to a baby. It is very challenging, however, to apply compassion in the face of hate. As a former parole officer, I remember a verbal confrontation I had between me and a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, and I can tell you firsthand that it would be a monumental task to push aside one's fears and hostilities and offer a big ol' hug to a white supremacist proudly wearing a swastika. Well, I found it difficult, if not impossible in that moment, to apply compassion to that person. It later dawned on me that perhaps if somebody did offer compassion to that person some point earlier in their life, they might have not ended up joining the Aryan Brotherhood in the first place. Jesus said that if someone strikes you, to turn the other cheek. Buddha said that hatred can never appease hatred. Only through non-hatred can hatred be appeased. Many other great spiritual teachers and philosophers have made similar statements. And while these assertions challenge us to apply compassion in the face of hatred and violence, there are those who would consider these simple, naive pleasantries perhaps better suited for other realities. We have had access to the teachings of Jesus, Buddha, and many other great teachers of love and compassion for over 2 millennia, and yet the human condition is still plagued by violence. Given the state of the world today, is it magical thinking to suggest that compassion could be an antidote to violence? As a researcher investigating the intersection of forensic psychology, neuroscience, and criminology, I delved into this topic and I'd like to share what I found with you. Particularly, I like to discuss it concerning the tensions between poor people and police because, as you can see, there are many black and white stereotypes of both police and poor people. My hope is by applying compassion on all sides, we can better understand the complexities of structural inequality and the impacts of violence on all sides. And perhaps you realize that the world isn't so black and white. Now I would like to discuss these complexities, particularly in terms of the relationships between structural inequality, violence, and the brain. In communities plagued by structural inequality, societies create conditions that lead to unfair disadvantages. For example, due to historical prejudice against African Americans, such as the Jim Crow laws, Southern strategy, and unfair drug sentencing, has led to a decrease in employment and educational opportunities in many black communities. Scarcity due to structural inequality leads to violence as members of these communities are forced to compete for resources or get resources through illicit means. As the rates of violence increase, so does the rates of exposure to violence, which again creates more violence. This is known as the cycle of violence. And research has shown that the cycle of violence leads to a neurological impact on those exposed to the cycle of violence. Specifically, research has found that both exposure to violence and the potential to commit violent acts is associated with changes in 3 interrelated brain networks: the executive control network, the salience network, and the default mode network of the brain. Changes in these brain networks can lead to feelings of hostility and violence. Interesting enough, compassion-based interventions lead to positive changes in these same brain networks. When people commit acts of violence, they often do so in response to perceived threats. And people tend to perceive more threats from those they consider to be part of outgroups. Outgroups are based off a variety of classifiers, including but not limited to race, religion, ethnicity, gang affiliation, political affiliation, even clothing style. For example, the U.S. prison system, where violence is highly prevalent, is a breeding ground to all manners of out-group-based violence, especially violence based on gang membership, race, and ethnicity. While these biases can be conscious, they can also be unconscious or implicit. Now, getting back to the context of police in poor communities, both community members in impoverished communities and law enforcement officials' exposure to violence leads them to increased risk to developing implicit biases. Both police and residents are more likely to become victims or witness violent crimes, and as a result are more likely to show symptoms of exposure to violence, such as anxiety, PTSD, or the increased likelihood of engaging in violent behavior. Also important to bring up is that these impoverished communities disproportionately consist of certain minority groups, including Hispanics and African Americans, and members of these groups are more likely to be victims of a violent crime, as well as being arrested and convicted of a violent crime. Research also shows that people tend to have implicit bias versus poor people versus black people, and increased implicit association between black faces and weapons. And as I'm sure many of you all know, statistics show that both African American and Hispanic men are more likely to be shot unarmed by police than their non-Hispanic white male counterparts. In these communities, though, regardless of racial makeup, there is increased rates of firearm violence, police shootings, and reports of police brutality. I remember a very terrifying incident that happened to me when I was a parole officer, when I stopped at a gas station not far from MLK Boulevard, and I was confronted by someone pointing a gun in my direction. In that moment, my salience network was so overpowered that if someone were to have given me an implicit bias task based off the identity of that person pointing the gun, I doubt I would have done well. Luckily, though, I was given the opportunity to return to that community later on as a caseworker, where I worked right across the street from the same gas station, and I helped former parolees of mine, as well as other people with felonies, find jobs. And it was a very powerful and healing experience for me, which gets to the second point of my talk: compassion. Since we know that these three brain networks are involved in violence, perhaps an intervention that targets these same brain networks will reduce violence. One powerful tool that we have in our disposal to do this is compassion. Research is beginning to show now that both Jesus and Buddha, guess what, are probably onto something. Compassion comes from the Latin root words, com, which means together, and pate, which means to suffer. And in terms of bridging differences, and as I pointed out earlier, both police and poor people suffer in very similar ways. Research has also shown that compassion involves genuine concern for others, the motivation to help, the recognition that all human beings suffer, that compassion is different from pity, compassion can be versus self or other, and that compassion is antagonistic to shame. Also important, compassion is tied to the same brain networks. For example, research has shown that compassion-based interventions improve connections and function in both the default mode network and the executive control network of the brain. Research has also shown that compassion-based interventions improve connections between the salience network and the other two aforementioned networks of the brain, which is important because violence has been shown to disrupt connections and function in these brain networks. In addition to the neurological connection, research has shown that compassion actually reduces violence in real life. One prominent example of this is the compassion workshop developed by Dr. Stephen Stosny, who designed this program to improve both self-compassion and compassion for others among both victims and abusers of domestic violence. And the compassion workshop was found to reduce violence committed by the perpetrators. Another group of compassion-based interventions are mindfulness-based interventions, which target increases in compassion by improving a trait called mindfulness, which involves being aware of our thoughts, feelings, and actions in the moment. Research with inmates has shown that mindfulness-based interventions reduce predictors of criminality such as impulsivity, substance abuse, and hostility, as well as improving psychological and emotional well-being. As a researcher, I had the opportunity to witness a bunch of inmates participating in a mindfulness-based meditation. And one of the inmates said something that really stuck with me. He said that he wished he had access to this earlier in his life, because if he did, he felt he never would have gotten involved in drugs or crime in the first place. In addition to inmates, research has shown that mindful-based interventions reduce stress and anger among police and implicit bias and aggression among the general population. So as you can see, compassion-based interventions show great promise at healing individuals exposed to violence. While this is noteworthy, we as a society need to go beyond just focusing on the individual and take a new look at justice and violent crime and develop a more compassionate criminal justice system. One good example of this is through restorative justice practices, which allow the violent offender to seek reconciliation through society, often by mediation between the perpetrator of the violent act and the victim and/or victim's family. Research has shown that restorative justice practices are beneficial to both the perpetrator and the victim. And also important to point out is that restorative justice practices actually reduce criminal reoffending. In terms of compassion-based policing, one good model for this is called community policing, which involves establishing trust and relationships between the police and the community as a means to stop violence. One powerful tenet of this is the guardian mindset, which is the mindset where police rely on de-escalating violence and cultural awareness to stop violence, as opposed to relying on force to stop violence as their primary means. Finally, we as a society need to take a more compassionate view of both police and poor people, rather than the black and white one that seems to perpetrate public discourse today. It is neither helpful to take sides or assign blame, it is extremely important that we recognize that structural inequality is linked to violence. It is also important to realize that it's both futile and disingenuous for us to assume that police do all of this and deal with structural inequality on their own. Rather, we need to come up with a more compassionate, multifaceted-based group of interventions that include advocating for policies that reduce structural inequality, the use of compassion-based interventions, the use of restorative justice, the use of community policing, and finally, we need to realize that both poor people and police are fellow humans worthy of compassion. Well, I am no Jesus nor Buddha. I can tell you by my academic, professional, and personal experience that compassion on a psychological level, a physiological level, a social and societal and spiritual level is the most powerful tool in our arsenal to stopping violence. While most of us, if not majority of us, would find it difficult or impossible to offer a hug to a Nazi, I do urge all of you, my friends, in these charged, trying times, to join me in applying compassion in the face of violence and hate. Thank you.